Well, like Jonah Goldberg, I too have visited the Occupy Wall Street folks. As you know, they've been showered with gifts from all of their supporters. In fact, they had to stop giving out all of the free food because the homeless had moved in and taken it over. So they've gotten so used to being on the welfare wagon that the other day I was down there, and sure enough, in front of a Burger King, I saw a very distraught protester. He'd just come out of Burger King and he was shaking his head. And I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "It's the first time it's happened." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Just now I actually had to spend some of my own money." Well, you all know from Fox News that the real power behind organizing the Occupy Wall Street folks has been something called the New York Communities of Change. This group is the old Acorn. They operate out of the same office, they have the same stationery, they have the same employees. They are Acorn. Remember, Acorn was an umbrella group of 196 entities. They had an organizational chart so confusing that the inside joke at Acorn was that our left hand doesn't know what our extreme left hand is doing. Well, they're back organizing Occupy Wall Street. If they're back doing that, let me tell you what else they're probably back doing. What was Acorn most famous for when they were not helping people set up child prostitution rings? They were famous for voter registration fraud. Well, they may be back with that. And I think that's one of the things we have to watch for as we end for the 2012 election. You know, ever since the Florida recount of 2000, we have seen an enormous amount of change in how elections are now conducted. It used to be you had to have a margin of victory. Now you have to have a margin of victory beyond litigation, beyond what the other side will sue over. Walter Dean Burnham, the Dean of American Political Scientists, said we have the sloppiest election systems of any industrialized country. You can't tell where the incompetence ends and the fraud begins. We have not done enough to restore election integrity. If you don't believe me, look at the Washington State governor's race in 2004. They found new ballots in King County 17 times. Look at the Al Franken Senate race in 2008. There were more felons who shouldn't have voted in that election than the margin of difference. And if you don't think that election mattered, remember, Obamacare only passed because they had 60 votes in the Senate for a few months before Scott Brown's victory. Al Franken was that 60th vote. So, they say voter fraud doesn't exist. Down in Mississippi a few weeks ago, the head of a liberal organization was sentenced to prison. She had voted 10 times in one election. 7 in the names of live people, 3 in the names of dead people. She didn't discriminate. Just last week, the head of elections in Madison County, Florida, was indicted, absentee ballot fraud. And they say voter fraud doesn't exist. Well, they not only say that, they say that laws to prevent it, having photo ID at the polls, tightening up absentee ballot restrictions, all of these, they say, are the return to Jim Crow. This is what Bill Clinton said the other day. There has never been in my lifetime, since we got rid of the Jim Crow burdens on voting, the determined effort to limit the franchise that we see today. Debbie Wasserman Schultz in July said, this is the functional equivalent of bringing back the poll tax and Jim Crow. Well, there's a problem with those contentions. They aren't true, and they came at a very inconvenient time. 3 days after Bill Clinton made that statement, the state of Rhode Island passed a photo ID law. Rhode Island is a liberal state. Rhode Island is a liberal state. Its legislature is 5-1 Democratic. It has an independent governor. The sponsor in the state house was Gordon Fox, the first African-American speaker. The sponsor in the state senate was Harold Metz, the only African-American state senator, both Democrats. This is what Mr. Metz said as to why in the world he was supporting photo ID. It has come to my attention, he said, that many people in my community have had their votes stolen. My own state representative and her daughter saw their votes stolen. This has been too often ignored. We ignore this at our peril. Those who do not believe that there is voter fraud also will do nothing to make the elections more transparent. Now, this procedure in Rhode Island passed through the Democratic legislature, signed by an independent governor, and Harold Metz said, "I have been criticized and called an Uncle Tom. I've been criticized and been called a traitor. I'm all for party loyalty, but God gave me a brain and I use it." Now, Harold Metz was attacked, and now we have another witness coming forward. Artur Davis was the Democratic congressman from Selma, Alabama, the cockpit of the civil rights struggle in the 1960s. He served in Congress until 2010 when he ran for governor. The teachers union took him out of the Democratic primary because he was for school choice and for various other constitutional reforms they didn't like. Artur Davis is a distinguished Democrat. He was the first Democratic congressman outside of Chicago to endorse Barack Obama in 2008. He was the Democratic congressman who seconded Barack Obama's nomination at the Denver Convention. But now that he's out of office, he has looked at his party, calling people who want voter integrity names, yelling racism in a crowded political theater. And this is what Artur Davis wrote in the Montgomery Advertiser, and I've interviewed him since then. "I've changed my mind on voter ID. When I was a congressman, I took the path of least resistance. Without any evidence, I lapsed into the rhetoric that requiring photo identification to vote is a suppression tactic aimed at thwarting black voters. The truth is," he said, "the most aggressive contemporary voter suppression in the African American community today is the wholesale manufacture of ballots. Voting the names of the dead, the non-existent, the too mentally impaired to function, cancels out the vote of citizens who are exercising their rights. That is suppression by any light. I've heard the peddlers of these ballots brag about it. I've been asked to provide the funds for voter fraud in my campaigns. I'm confident it has changed the results of several close elections. There is no question that a voter ID law must be passed." Artur Davis was attacked for that. He was attacked for that. He also deplored, he said, the intimidation that was visited upon Senator Metz and the other people in Rhode Island who bravely stood up for voter ID. He said anyone who stands up for this law is going to be attacked, but it's the right thing. Because in the end, some of the most tragic victims of voter fraud in this country are in the minority communities who try to fight the machine in their communities, and the reformers in those communities have their votes stolen from them, whether it's in Detroit or in St. Louis or in Alabama or in Rhode Island. They have their votes stolen by political machines that want to continue to oppress them. Voter fraud affects all of us. Now, what can be done about this? We have to push back. Yesterday, the Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives sent a letter to all 50 secretaries of state, and they asked them not to enforce any of these new photo ID laws, not to enforce any of the laws designed to protect voter integrity. And, yes, last week the Obama White House opened a counteroffensive against these changes in election laws to improve voter integrity. The effort is being led by White House counsel Robert Bauer. This is right out of the Obama White House. Says one campaign official to the Wall Street Journal, quote, "We will look at what the states have done. We will look for ways to counter it through litigation, through administrative interpretation. Beyond that, you have a program that is clearly offensive and must be stopped." We must stop them. All of you have an obligation to go out and not just campaign for the people you support, not just to contribute money and time to the people you support, but to make sure the elections are monitored. There's an organization called True the Vote, based out of Houston, Texas. You could look it up. They are starting a nationwide bipartisan, because voter fraud can occur in both parties, bipartisan organization designed to have people trained and ready to detect voter fraud, whether it's absentee ballot fraud or fraud at the polls, and make sure it's stopped. And you know, just like disease, a little prevention can cure a lot. A little voter fraud prevention, just knowing that someone is watching, can tell people, you know, maybe I shouldn't commit that fraud if there's even the slightest chance that I might be caught or exposed. Now, we used to have Democrats who cared about this. We now have people like Congressman Davis and Senator Metz, but we used to have national Democrats. Senator Chris Dodd of Connecticut helped pass the Help America Vote Act in 2002. What he said is, this country must have a system in which it is easy to vote. We want everyone to vote, but hard to cheat. He said, we can do this. I agree with him. Unfortunately, the rhetoric and the campaign has become very much polarized. But we, citizens of goodwill from whatever party, from whatever part of the country, must join forces with people like Senator Metz and Congressman Davis. Join forces and make sure that voter fraud and voter incompetence no longer govern any of our elections. Ultimately, the choice must be the people's choice. It must not be left to people who try to put a thumb on the scales of an election or try to throw it in court and have the judges decide the election. I am pleased to be the chronicler of these efforts. I'm rewriting my book. My current edition of my book, Stealing Elections, I'll be signing copies of it in the South Foyer. I'll be happy to hear from you. Every time I do this, I hear stories of election irregularities. I'm happy to collect them from you. And I will just leave you with this. The 2012 election, you know, is one of the most momentous of our lives. We do not want it to end like Florida in 2000, where for 47 days this country was torn apart because some people wanted to recount some counties and not others, some people wanted to finagle some ballots and not others. We cannot afford that again. The worst possible result is an election that becomes close because of fraud or incompetence. It gets thrown into the courts, and no one is satisfied with the result. Let's have a clean election. Let's win this fair and square.